Something's up at 3 Savile Row. It's January in England, but there's a crew milling about on the roof of Applecore. Director Michael Lindsay Hogg is here, running 10 cameras at once. 5 on the roof, 1 across the street, 3 at street level, and a hidden camera at the reception desk for when the cops inevitably show up. What he's planning isn't exactly legal. Meanwhile, producer George Martin and engineer Glyn Johns are in the basement manning the board. Assistant Alan Parsons is in charge of the tapes. They're recording something, though it's unsure what it'll be. Whatever it is, there's a CCTV monitor, so the guys downstairs can see what's going on outside, and a PA to communicate. Paul McCartney appears first to scope out the scene. Linda Eastman is here too, but isn't seen on the roof. Ringo Starr appears next, with his wife Maureen. He's wearing her red raincoat. George Harrison is the only one dressed remotely appropriately for the weather. He's wearing the Mary Quant coat from his wedding to Pattie Boyd. She is notably absent. Finally, John Lennon appears with Yoko Ono. She was granted a divorce a few days ago. The guys are accompanied by roadie Mal Evans and special guest Billy Preston, who was originally in town for some TV appearances. Though the public won't have it in their hands for another year and 4 months, on this day, January 30th, 1969, the Beatles are set to debut a new album of material. This is their first public show in nearly 3 years. It will be their last. Hi, I'm Abby, I have a lot of records, and this is Let It Re. So welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time here. Vinyl Monday is the who, what, when, where, why, and how do I feel about classic albums in my collection. If deep dives aren't your thing, don't worry. I also do Vinyl Monday in 60 seconds, here on my channel, over on my Instagram, as well as TikTok. My past 3 Beatles-related episodes have made it glaringly apparent I needed to redux this week's album. I first covered it back in YouTube Vinyl Monday's infancy. If you've seen the original, you'll know why we're here today. A handful of recent acquisitions, the restoration of Michael Lindsay Hogg's titular film, and an audience poll have all brought this episode to fruition. You the people willed it. This week's album is The Beatles' Let It Be. Congrats if you guessed this one. Remember, if you want to play along, all you gotta do is check out my community tab. That's where I post my hints to what next week's album is gonna be. I host polls where sometimes you get to pick what's on the series, like this week. I make announcements when I'm places that aren't here. You can find all of that on my channel. One quick thing before I take the plastic off, I just want to give a shout out to YouTube Beatle historian Lars Land. Lars's Let It Be video was supposed to go up long before mine, but the YouTube copyright system continuously struck huge chunks of her video until she was forced to make the original a Patreon exclusive. It was either that or the video never saw the light of day, and she works too hard and her work is just too good for a video to go to waste like that. It looks like she's just posted a new version as of me filming this. That will be linked in my description. If you want to see someone who really knows her Beatle history, I cannot recommend her channel enough. Her videos are great, and if you wish to see her Let It Be video as she originally intended, you should subscribe to her Patreon. Alright, announcement time over. Let's take the plastic off. So my copy is, well, figuratively and literally, there's a lot to unpack here. This was my first copy. She's a US original, a little crusty, but I still love her. But I knew if I was gonna cover Let It Be the way I wanted to cover Let It Be, this wasn't gonna cut it. I'd have to shell out for the Super Deluxe box set. Which I did. Shout out to the Discogs seller I got this from. I'm pretty sure they were running a discount because I got this thing for just over half the retail price. And this was sealed when I bought it. This beautiful baby is the Let It Be Motherlode. B-roll Abby will be showing you all of this stuff. It includes the 2021 Giles Martin remix of this album, which is the jacket I'll be holding up for the rest of the video. Yeah, don't even bother with the original original master at this point. The quality of Giles Martin Let It Be is up there with his Sgt. Pepper's and better than his White Album, but I don't think we're quite ready for that conversation yet. There's 2 discs of rehearsals and jams, an EP with even more mixes, and Glyn Johns' Get Back. We haven't even rolled transition and we're already getting into Let It Be lore. So Let It Be was originally a project called Get Back. Several potential mixes were made, but all of them were rejected. The box set includes the 1969 mix in full, plus some of the 1970 mixes on the EP. We also get this super awesome book, Us Dumb Americans Did Not Get the Get Back book with our original Let It Be, but that meant our production costs were a third less, so take that. Our Let It Be was cheaper. We dumped your tea in the harbor. So, let's talk about this cover art. The front was designed by John Kosh with photography by Ethan Russell. John's photo comes from the rooftop concert, George and Ringo's come from rehearsals at Apple Studios, and Paul's from early rehearsals at Twickenham. All of these photos represent the 3 central locations to the music we hear on the album, and what we see in the film. I'll have to pull out my original here, but opening up the gatefold, we have more photos by Ethan, more shots from Twickenham, the roof, and the control room at Apple. And on the back, we have a blurb from Apple press officer Derek Taylor in which he states, quote, "This is a new phase Beatles album. I don't usually talk about the labels on the disc, but Let It Be's are of interest. Have you ever noticed the apple is red and not green? This is because Let It Be was distributed by United and not Apple. Nowadays, most record labels do the distributing, but back in the 60s and 70s, they were different entities. We literally do not have the time to explain the details today." On Let It Be, we of course have the Beatles, consisting of John Lennon on lead vocals, guitar, steel guitar on For You Blue, and some 6-string bass. Paul McCartney on vocals, bass, and piano, with some guitar, keys, and percussion. George Harrison on guitar, lead vocals on I Me Mine and For You Blue, and tambura on Across the Universe, and Ringo Starr on drums and various percussion. Our special guests include Billy Preston on keys, arrangements by John Barham, Richard Hewson, and Brian Rogers, and George Martin pops in for some instrumentation on Across the Universe and Dig It. Let It Be was produced by Phil Spector. The guys who really put in that work were George Martin and Glyn Johns. Roll transition.
And now, your host for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
Okay, so, like Michael Lindsay Hogg's impossible task of presenting anywhere between 55 and 65 hours of footage in a clear, concise 80-minute package, I have a very difficult task this week. Sure, summarizing a 3-part, 8-hour docuseries is tough, but plenty of people have done that. My challenge is, how the hell do I summarize the making of Let It Be without it being a complete retelling of Get Back? Furthermore, how do I talk about Let It Be when I'm also talking about Get Back? The theme of the day really seems to be jumping right into things. Let It Be and Get Back are some kind of bizarro chicken and egg situation. We clearly know which came first, but which comes first? Which do you consume first? Which do you consider first? Without the 50-something hours of Get Back footage, we wouldn't have Let It Be, but without Let It Be, we wouldn't have Get Back. Michael Lindsay Hogg's answer is the chicken came first. He calls Let It Be, quote, the father of Get Back. I'm putting a pin in this for later. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'll take you through the circumstances that put the Beatles in Twickenham. I will summarize/review Get Back, compare and contrast it with Let It Be, then review Let It Be. To begin with, White Album production was a grade A shit show. It was their first honest-to-goodness album production without longtime manager Brian Epstein, and it's clear they were set totally adrift after his very sudden death. Beginning with Sgt. Pepper's, there's two big shifts happening with how the guys make music. Number one, the guys don't have to worry about reproducing these sounds for a live setting. They can go buck wild with production. Because all the guys were cutting their parts separately, they rarely got to jam. The lack of their tried and true creative process inflames communication breakdowns that were already happening. And number 2, John has stepped down as de facto leader of the Beatles. Amidst a very public divorce and less public but no less active heroin addiction, he is going through it and is just not in the shape to play leader. Thus, Paul steps up. His leadership style is very different and doesn't always gel well with the others, especially George. He is getting frustrated with having only a handful of songs make each record. He has more songs than ever because he's more comfortable contributing when the guys aren't jamming. As for Ringo, he's just being Ringo. This joke is not me writing him off, it's merely stating his life got 100% more interesting when he was no longer a Beatle. Around the time Michael Lindsay Hogg wraps production on the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus,
I'm now your host for this evening, the Rolling Stones.
Now that would be one hell of an episode. He approaches Paul for a potential Beatles project. Paul sees this as the perfect opportunity to, no pun intended, get the band back on track. Get Back is born. The day after New Year's 1969, the Beatles plus roadie Mal Evans, director Michael Lindsay Hogg, and John's girlfriend Yoko Ono converge on Twickenham Studios to begin work on something. Yeah, right from the jump, the original Get Back concept was flimsy. The original idea was a TV special. It'd feature jamming and rehearsals, 2 shows would be filmed, and they'd pick the best numbers from each. The Beatles were at Twickenham because of the Hey Jude video. The guys liked the experience. It was kind of like All You Need Is Love, but without the pressure of a live broadcast. Ringo's film The Magic Christian will be filming at Twickenham. Portions of A Hard Day's Night and Help were shot there too. As for the record, according to Paul in the anthology, he, quote, didn't think we were consciously going for a live feeling in those sessions. He admits he straight up didn't remember. He probably doesn't remember because the guys were drunk as fuck during rehearsals. They were constantly sending for beer and wine. Roadie Kevin was tasked with mixing roadies. On top of that, Paul is pretty visibly stoned. Get Back became stuff that would easily translate to a live performance. No overdubs, multi-tracks, wacky effects, or other studio wizardry. This would have been in keeping with the post-psychedelia, back-to-basics trend in music. George just had an 8-track at home, at Kinfon's no less. This was a year before he bought Friar Park to build a home studio in, and lends it to production. Fun fact, a 10 grand 8-track machine would cost roughly $175,000 today. Quote, the Beatles face a daunting task. They must write and rehearse 14 new songs and perform them live 2 weeks from now. What could possibly go wrong? Predictably, quite literally, all of the Beatles' best laid plans go to shit. Here's the Get Back project, according to Peter Jackson. Yes, the Lord of the Rings guy. Of course they handed off the 8-hour docu-series to the Lord of the Rings guy. It makes too much sense. Here's something to remember when watching a documentary. Every doc has an angle. That includes Get Back. It was produced by Paul, Ringo, Yoko, Olivia Harrison, and is hosted by the Mouse. So there's no way in hell we will see John openly whacked out on the horsey or Paul talking about STDs, both of which happened during these sessions. This is a package of anywhere between 55 and 65 hours of footage. A lot of unflattering stuff was left out. Consider the montages. The rock and roll music sequence cuts between performance footage and now, communicating the shift in group dynamics. And the episode 1 closer. Post-George exit, Isn't It a Pity plays as if he wrote it about this incident. He did not. He wrote this song in 1966. As the viewer, we're afforded had the advantage of retrospect. This is true for both Get Back and Let It Be. Michael and the guys don't know what they're working towards for most of the project, but we do. Having the advantage of a longer runtime, streaming didn't exist in 1969, and unless you were Andy Warhol doing weird Andy Warhol things, neither did 8+ hour movies. So we get to see so many things that had to be left out of Let It Be. For starters, the guys immediately point out this place is not ideal for making music. That makes sense. It's built for making films. It's way too open. And the group having trouble staying on track without a set-in-stone deadline. This is a running theme for pretty much the rest of the project. Looking at you, John. However, quote, "When I'm up against the wall, Paul, you'll find I'm at my best." And John's not wrong. John literally works best under pressure. Rubber Soul was some of his best writing, and they only had, 3 weeks to slam that shit together? Paul comes to agree with this on the last day, but in the moment, he's like a stressed mother trying to manage John's procrastination and Ringo babbling into the mic.
Stop that goddamn feedback!
Get Back's greatness lies in the way it illuminates the Beatles' creative process and utterly disproves the long-standing myth that production was acrimonious. This is a much more well-rounded picture of how sessions went. We see Paul pulling the threads of what will become Get Back out of thin air and the guys jamming on it. We have numbers from future solo records popping up, like All Things Must Pass, Backseat of My Car. Paul helps John write Gimme Some Truth, which he didn't remember doing until Peter Jackson showed him the footage. This was such a creative time in Beatle history. We got Let It Be, stuff for future solo records, and like 3/4 of Abbey Road. Most of the medley, plus Oh Darling, Octopus's Garden, She's So Heavy, Something
Attracts me like a pomegranate.
People seem to forget that the Get Back sessions and the rooftop show are why Abbey Road exists. This is grounds for an Abbey Road redux! While watching run-through after run-through may be tedious as hell, downright excruciating for a non-musician like me. I do not have the patience to be in a band, that's why I'm a critic. But all this hard work makes the rooftop concert feel like equal parts miraculous battlefield victory and a glimpse at the good old days. It takes a number or two for them to settle in, but once you hit Dig a Pony, they're in the bag. The guys do have their moments. See the enduring Lennon-McCartney show, George quitting the band, John routinely showing up late, and Paul micromanaging while simultaneously having no idea what Get Back is supposed to be. Nobody knew what Get Back was supposed to be, not even Michael. Throughout rehearsals, poor Michael is running around like a chicken with its head cut off, trying to figure out what the hell he's doing here. He's a director. He likes having a plan and executing it, so it's no wonder that by day 15 of endless noodling, he gets a little pissy. Time and time again, he facilitates conversations and suggests ideas. He thought Twickenham was too easy, and really pushed for a show on a barge in Tripoli, but George says what everyone is thinking, calling it insane. An airport, an orphanage, a hospital for sick kids, but not really sick kids. He wants something that will translate well to film. Michael even plays peacemaker. Paul's telling the guys they need to get their shit together while Michael's saying, you all need to get your shit together. We're running out of film and that guy in the fur coat is running out of tape. But if Magical Mystery Tour was any indication, the Beatles are musicians, not filmmakers. They're more concerned with making an album. That's what they do. Paul's #1 motivation with this, though, was trying to keep the only thing he knew together. In doing so, he was acting like he knew what he was doing, but he didn't. Get Back is spectacular redemption for Paul, who, for reasons we'll get into later, was painted as the villain of the Beatles' breakup for a long time. He wasn't used to being leader. He always looked to John, who is relishing being second in command, and, while sometimes irritating, is the necessary comic relief.
God damn you, little microphone.
Like, are we sure this guy didn't have ADHD? The wild revelation that was the hidden mic in the flower pot and a previously unseen band meeting really vindicated George. As a George girly, I can recognize that he would throw his proverbial toys out of the crib. He was the baby of the group after all. But it's refreshing to see others acknowledge he was outgrowing his old role in the Beatles. He'd been playing with John and Paul since he was 14 years old. No wonder he was sick of their shit. We even see him informing John that he's assembling an album of his own. For a George girly who appreciates a well-rounded picture of the guy, Get Back is a great watch. But he's never beating the food-driven allegations. Through it all, Ringo is the sunflower, a hardy, hard-working, eternal optimist who continually turns his face to the light despite the storm raging around him. He desperately clings to hope that the band will survive this year, asserting Michael's only surmising this will be their last show. One of the things I appreciate most about Get Back is the ensemble cast, seeing typically behind-the-scenes characters take center stage. See Mal Evans dragging Michael up to the roof by his arms. Michael and George Martin looking stiff in their suits while the guys are wearing bright colors and furs makes them look like the grown-ups and the little kids at play. During the rooftop show, we see Mal trying to defuse the situation with the cops by straight up playing dumb. He was a real one, as was Billy Preston. He feels like the savior of the whole damn thing when he serendipitously drops in on sessions at Apple. Appearances by Linda and Heather are especially heartwarming. And then there's Patty. When she drops in on Can You Dig It, you can tell something's off. If you've seen the All Things Must Pass episode or know the story of Hear Me Lord, you'll know why. Speaking of Patty Boyd, Eric Clapton musician just about sent me into orbit, but the breakout star of Get Back was, without a doubt, Glenn motherfucking Johns. You should have seen my corner of the internet when Get Back first dropped. I don't know if it was the shock of suddenly being presented with our ideal man who was under our noses the entire time, or if we were all ovulating at once or what. But the girlies were going crazy for Glenn, myself included. I am not ashamed to admit that I am down bad for a random British bloke in a big white coat. A man who can play engineer, producer, babysitter, and knows how to dress? What can't the man do? And yes, I said producer. George Martin was largely absent for the Get Back sessions. He shows up towards the end, sees the disarray everything was in, realizes he should never have left the Beatles without adult supervision, and takes over real fast. Glenn had a solid resume, including work with Spooky Tooth, The Pretty Things, and The Small Faces, but it was his work on the Stones' recently released Beggar's Banquet that impressed Paul. I don't remember this moment appearing in either film, but another album Glenn worked on is released during the events of the Get Back project.
Want to hear some of this Jimmy Page album?
Jimmy Page.
Yeah.
What is it? No big deal, just one of the greatest debut albums of all time! However, Glenn nearly ruined the Beatles gig for himself. Quote, I was at home on a very rare night off and the phone rang, and the person on the other end announced themselves in a Liverpudlian accent as being Paul McCartney. Thinking it was a prank call from Mick J, he told Paul to f*** off. Once he realized it was the real Paul McCartney on the line, he redeemed himself and more. In Get Back, the guys call for him like they would their producer or otherwise their mommy. George basically said, Mom, how do we make the piano sound bad? Some guy shoves newspaper inside a grand piano and boom, it's the take of For You Blue. He didn't know he was supposed to be producer until the second or third day when George Martin was just like not showing up. He felt quite insecure about the whole thing until Martin gave him a pep talk over lunch. So why aren't either of them credited as producers on Let It Be? After the rooftop concert, Michael Lindsay Hogg started going through his footage footage to assemble a film. They throw out Get Back as a single, and feeling inspired by this win, the guys head back into EMI. Get Back is put on the back burner for what would become Abbey Road, but there's a dark cloud looming overhead. After playing in the rock and roll circus, John gets in good with the Stones' manager, Alan Klein. I won't recount the whole thing here, as I already did that in the McCartney 1 video, but just know the question of who will be the Beatles' new manager and the answer of Alan Klein drives a wedge between Paul and the rest of the band. Meanwhile, Glyn is still assembling versions of Get Back in the background. With each iteration, the album is shaped more in the image of the film, but each is rejected, and consequently bootlegged to shit. Enter absolute madman Phil Spector, and not absolute madman in the funny way like John Lennon. No, Phil is straight up unhinged. John and George facilitated Phil into gussying up what is now Let It Be for release. In handing the project off to him, the original Get Back concept is gone. Phil adds in extensive overdubbing, choral vocals, and orchestral arrangements. Paul, George, and Ringo all okayed crediting Glyn Johns and George Martin as producers, but John made the move not to. Glyn was confused by this. He only asked for a credit, no royalties, and still doesn't understand why John was suspicious of that. Martin was straight up not happy about the snub, infamously saying, quote, "What they should do is have a credit saying, produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." Paul agreed, see Let It Be Naked some 33 years later, but the track listing of this Let It Be goes as follows. And now for your host this evening, the Bottles. Opening up side 1, we have Two of Us, followed by Dig a Pony, then Across the Universe, then I Me Mine, next Dig It, followed by Let It Be, and side 1 closes with Maggie May. Opening up side 2, we've got I've Got a Feeling, followed by One After 909, then The Long and Winding Road, next For You Blue, and the album closes with Get Back. Let It Be was released in May of 1970, and oh boy, this is where things get spicy. While Phil Spector was dressing up Let It Be for release alongside the film, Paul was bouncing around EMI and 2 other unaffiliated studios under a fake name to record McCartney 1. Long story short, in response to the other Beatles plus Alan Klein moving to delay McCartney 1's release as not to compete with Let It Be and Hey Jude, Paul throws a spectacular bitch fit and breaks up the Beatles. This forever colors reception of McCartney 1, Let It Be, which is now the last Beatles album, and Let It Be. For a long time, Let It Be has been considered 80-something minutes of the Beatles cruising towards a breakup. It's literally not. If it were, then Michael would have featured George leaving the band. But why is this? Here are the Get Back sessions according to Michael Lindsay Hogg. It's worth noting my first experience with the film was the 2024 remaster. Context, Let It Be was shot in 16mm for the original TV concept, but blown up to 35mm for a theater release. So until our year of the Lord 2024, it looked like ass. A quick note on the MAL demix and restoration technology. They seem to have worked out a lot of the kinks since Get Back. It's only been 3 years, and I gotta say, some of that AI is already aging bad. Hair, backgrounds, the texture of Glyn's coat especially. This was the first official release of Let It Be since like the 80s, so I've only ever known it with the director's note at the beginning, a conversation between Peter Jackson and Michael Lindsay Hogg. Michael describes his experience working on this project. He thought he was doing a concert film. After about 10 days, they lost the plot and are just doing a documentary. Then by the end of Get Back, we're doing a show again. He asserts the rehearsals are great quality material, but there was so much repetition and he wasn't used to that. It's interesting to note that he takes credit for the rooftop idea idea, while Glynn takes credit for it in his Far Out interview. Peter identifies the retrospective lens which both himself and the audience see this project through. Michael was one of the very few people who wasn't afforded that. Okay, now it's the film. I love that Mal is the first person we see. The guys really cherished him, but right off the bat, this feels different. Paul's piano intro is ominous and forlorn, almost baroque. The Apple Core is quite artsy. It's a double meaning for Apple Core and the decaying Beatles. We jump immediately into action at Twickenham with Don't Let Me Down, our first sighting of John, and Yoko. In Let It Be, her presence is immediate. She is shown on camera fully making out with John. Yoko is here and she is not going away. I have to say, Get Back afforded her a more well-rounded portrayal. This very well could have something to do with her producing the film. She's shown mending clothes, practicing calligraphy, bringing records in, and dancing with John. We get these two very telling quotes from Paul. If it came to a push between Yoko and the Beatles, it's Yoko. She's John's security blanket, 100%. Let It Be and Get Back both show her as such. It's gonna be such an incredible comical thing in 50 years' time. They broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. It's like Paul knows the accusatory finger always finds itself pointed at a woman. Get Back makes moves to take that finger and point it back at the Beatles. They got themselves in this situation. Let It Be doesn't. The biggest differences between Let It Be and Get Back are edit and tone. Like I said earlier, streaming didn't exist when Michael Lindsay Hogg and his editors were assembling Let It Be. They had very specific constraints, a feature film length product to be released in theaters. So a lot of editing decisions had to be made. This edit doesn't make distinctions what events happened on which day. It's up to the viewer to remember, which is difficult when you can't pause or rewind. Unless you own the theater. The rehearsals feel less free since we don't get to see the jamming and banter in between. Nevertheless, I do still get a sense of fun in some moments. You know, Heather is spinning around and having a ball. You can tell this thing was made pre-TikTok and social media. People had longer attention spans and could sit with these longer shots. We see Paul fully instructing chord changes, a very different portrayal of the I'll play whatever you want me to play thing. Here, it feels like Paul's being the aggressor rather than trying to help. There's no way for Michael to know what would go down with McCartney 1, but I imagine this edit only added fuel to the Paul is the villain fire. There's still an attempt to show Lennon-McCartney's waning silly side, flubbing words and giggling, but hell, even the colors are different. That absolutely affects tone. Even the Apple basement looks less vibrant, and it's a plain white room. There's no cutaways or montages of past scenes. This makes sense, as all this stuff only happened 2 to 4 years ago when Let It Be was first released. Take Paul reminiscing on cutting class to write stuff like One After 909 and Fancy Me Chances. It would feel like we were really talking with him if it wasn't an overhead shot. There was a concerted effort on Michael's part to not make things too intimate, which is certainly a choice. The biggest change was ending the film with the rooftop concert. Get Back kinda does this, but in Let It Be, we see the Apple sessions that produced the two of us before they go up to the roof. Even though the roof happened first, and the reason we're back in the basement is because the roof got shut down by the cops. This choice does affect the story arc, but I understand why it was made. In the OG timeline, we've already attained the prize by now, and there'd be less payoff seeing this after the rooftop. I do appreciate the effort to uphold the ominous feeling of the cops staring them down as they round out the set. However, because we, as the modern viewer, now know how much context we're missing, the build-up and excitement to this is non-existent. The Beatles and their associates did not like Let It Be. Paul trash talks it in Anthology. Glynn flat out said Let It Be is awful and not at all representative of how rehearsals really went. Quote, "My memory was that we actually had a really good time and everybody got on great. People who work together for years on end, they fall out and they patch it up at the end. it's normal. A lot more diplomatic about it in typical Ringo fashion. He said, quote, "My cut of the movie would have been different, and I'm sure John's cut at the time would have been different, and Paul's cut. I thought there was a lot more interesting stuff than Michael Lindsay Hogg put in. Here's what I think. Though Let It Be came first, Get Back is the father of Let It Be. The project, aimless as it was for so long, produced this film. I recognize that Michael did the very best he could with the strict guidelines he was working under. However, I can't tell if his edit was meant to convey a fraught, difficult time in Beatle history or a serious, nose-to-the-grindstone working time. That is Let It Be's Achilles heel. So if Get Back has rendered Let It Be obsolete, why do we need both? There are plenty of repeat scenes. George getting electrocuted at Twickenham, I'll play what you want me to play, George helping Ringo with Octopus's Garden, the what the hell are we doing conversation, and this A+ moment from Rooftop Don't Let Me Down. But A, there are entire numbers of the concert shown in Let It Be that weren't in Get Back. Rehearsals too, we get a lot more of the last day at Apple and a taste of the flamenco bit cut from I Me Mine. B, there were some unflattering moments in Let It Be cut out of Get Back. And C, every documentary has an angle. Peter and Michael's angles are fundamentally different. Put Get Back and Let It Be together, and you have the fullest picture of the project. Fuller than any Beatle fan in 1970 would have had. So, what about the soundtrack? Reception of this thing in 1970 was checkered. It was a Beatles release, so of course the public ate it up, even more so considering the breakup controversy. But critics at the time did not feel the same. See John Mendelsohn for Rolling Stone. Quote, "They put the load on their new friend P. Spector, who in turn whipped out his orchestra and choir and proceeded to turn several of the rough gems on the best Beatle album in ages to costume jewelry. He singles out Long and Winding Road and I Me Mine as overdone, praises numbers like Dig a Pony and Get Back, and spits truth when he says Don't Let Me Down was a criminal omission. Hi-Fi curtly said the album, quote, wasn't nearly as bad as the movie. Others were a little kinder, like Christgau of all people. To him, the title track was overdone, along with Long and Winding Road. He all but calls it a creative regression from Abbey Road. Quote, "Their assurance and wit would be the envy of veteran rock and rollers, and though this is a little lightweight, it makes up in charm." William Mann for the New York Times was a little more positive as well. So, what do I think of Let It Be? And now for your host this evening, the Rolling Stones. My biggest critiques of Let It Be as an album package: number 1, superfluous additions by Phil, and number 2, the sequencing. The former has been worked around in various interpretations of this material. The latter is a bit of an impossible question. As I wrote this review, and my old one for that matter, I had the same realization both times. There very well may be no truly good running order of this material. It was recorded in 4 different contexts: rehearsals, the Apple rooftop, the Apple studio, and EMI like a year after the fact. It's hard to marry all that. The fact that this is also technically a film soundtrack was another obstacle to work around. I've never seen this as a film soundtrack first. I've always thought it an album. So through my track-by-track breakdown, I'll just be treating it as such. I Dig a Pygmy by Charles Hawtrey and the Deaf Aids. Phase 1, in which Doris gets her oats. I adore Two of Us. Even though Paul wrote it about himself and Linda, it feels much more like an ode to Lennon-McCartney. You and I have memories longer than the road that stretches out ahead. Feels like an acknowledgement of the long shadow they cast at such a young age. All of these guys will be trying to live up to their output in this stage of their lives for the rest of their careers. Through this lens, You and Me Chasing Paper, Getting Nowhere reads as an admittance that they've been spinning their wheels in the mud for the past year. They're grown-ups now, getting married, having kids. They're no longer the little boys who ran around in matching raincoats. I'm not totally sure how I feel about this as an opener. It's a bit subdued dude for the first spot, but it's a cute nod to the fans. A cozy feel to settle into, with light acoustic guitar, cuddly harmonies, a typically tender Paul delivery, and a really great melodic bass line. Even though Paul says we're burning matches on Two of Us, Dig a Pony feels like the spark that ignites Let It Be. Especially the false start. It feels like having to the lighter a couple times before getting the flame. The rooftop concert was so special because there was just this energy in the air, the spontaneity, the act of doing something these guys hadn't done in years. There was a tinge of defiance too, knowing the cops could show up at any moment. It's like static in the air. That energy is so electric, it couldn't help but turn up on the recordings. That's why most of my favorites are from the rooftop, Dig a Pony included. We have absolutely stream of consciousness lyrics coming from expert-level word associator John, coming up with odd turns of phrase like dig a pony, you can syndicate any boat you row, that mean absolutely nothing but sound great. Pair that with as simple a hook as All I Want Is You, and you get something totally ephemeral, perfect for capturing this setting. John's compositions allow free space for gorgeous harmonies to manifest themselves. His voice was a little wily, see Don't Let Me Down, but it was always right. This era of the Beatles did a damn good riff. That's part of why this is my favorite era of the Beatles. This one is bossy and loud. At first, I wasn't crazy about Across the Universe following Dig a Pony. If you've got 3 songwriters on a record, it makes sense to introduce them one after the other. Two of Us is Paul, Dig a Pony John, so I Me Mine would be George. But when you hear Across the Universe, you realize there are 2 Johns talking. One John cranks up his amp and is the king of nonsense lyrics. Everything means nothing, but the other John is careful, deliberate, which is why I am so mad that Phil Spector trampled all over Across the Universe. All we needed was John, his guitar, George on tambura, and a little percussion. Instead, we have a Disney movie orchestra and choir. It takes such a delicate song and forces its hand. Images of wind tumbling through a letterbox, scattering papers, rain through a paper cup capture a totally untethered, free feeling. Just listen to this. Limitless, undying love, which shines around me like a million suns and calls me on and on across the universe. This experience John sings of is blindingly bright. It might be terrifying, like seeing a biblical angel. See a million eyes, but it's not scary because he feels loved and protected. These were the most profound, beautiful lyrics John ever wrote. The music is gorgeous too. John's guitar is airy and I feel my very consciousness being stretched to both ends at the tambura drone. That's the thing I love about the White Album and Let It Be. The most beautiful songs you've ever heard are sandwiched by Post Supreme. After something so placid as Across the Universe, the open bitterness of I Me Mine feels jarring. That's not very Hare Krishna of you, George. No one's frightened of playing it. Everyone's saying it, flowing more freely than wine. Even the title invokes the ego. I, me, mine. It comes through on George's belabored delivery through the last verse. While it may seem like I'm anti-Phil from my rants on Across the Universe, I'm not. See my hour-long review of All Things Must Pass where I praise the drama he rightfully infused those songs with. Phil does just that on I Me Mine. Bold, swaggering brass, cinematic strings, and choir, those choices make sense with the song's origins. The waltz time was inspired by the ballroom scene in Europa, the titled and untitled. This is just a cool song, snapping between sections of beautiful, sweeping motions and bluesy drive. Dig It is a fun interlude which shows the fitness of John's word association. FBI, BBC, see B.B. King, Doris Day. What is it with him and Doris? But on a Phil Spector interpretation of these sessions, entirely divorced from its original Back to Basics concept, a jam just feels out of place, especially one that's been cut down so far. It takes up valuable space on a disc that could and should have Don't Let Me Down. Let It Be is a tough one. It's the title track, so it holds a certain level of importance. Even more so considering its personal significance to Paul, the story of which he told over and over again at every interview he did for like 50 fucking years. Let It Be was made the thesis statement of this project for a reason, but that might have been its downfall. Part of me feels as though the guys did so many run-throughs of Let It Be, making sure it was perfect that it lost all its feeling. It covers very similar ground to Hey Jude. They're both mid-tempo, piano-driven, inspirational, triumphant, keep your chin up songs. And Hey Jude is way better. I don't like it when a song tries to be anthemic. Either it is or it isn't. I don't like the organ refrain and hate the echo-style cymbal. They're both cheesy. We don't need it shoved in our faces that this is a gospel-inspired song, we know! But I like the guitar solo. It's structured and executed well. It's the grounding force this thing needs. And I do love the story behind the song and acknowledge how dear it is to Paul. Maggie May is another fun little ditty from the sessions, but like Dig It, it doesn't quite fit this interpretation with Across the Universe and I Me Mine. You are all so lucky I can't roll my R's or else I'd be doing this incessantly. On to my two favorite numbers from the rooftop, I've Got a Fever, I've Got a Feeling, and One After 909. I didn't fully appreciate I've Got a Feeling until seeing Get Back. Ringo has feel like no other. He knows exactly when to push forward and pull back. I've Got a Feeling is chock full of all-time great Beatles riffs. There's like 3 in this one song, it's ridiculous. This ramp of energy, great lead and rhythm work by George and John. MVP Billy Preston shines on this thing. He gave this era of Beatles so much dimension. I wish they stuck it out for a little longer, if not for some more collabs with him. He adds pings of brightness to the choruses and ultra-memorable flourishes. Paul's shout singing is at times laughable, see ooh you off McCartney 1, but after contributing so many cozy, buttoned-up tunes, it's nice to see him let loose. Lyrically, I've Got a Feeling is a picture of moving into 1969. 68 was a crazy year for the Beatles, personally. Sure, you have to be under duress to make Rev 9. Everybody had a hard year. Everybody had a good time. It was crazy on the world stage too. Assassinations of various figures associated with social change, student protests cropping up at universities all over the states. Everybody let their hair down has a double meaning for people both adopting the hippie look and lifestyle, followed by everybody put their socks up, everybody put their foot down. Contrast this with Paul's chorus, singing of a nondescript feeling he can't hide. I've Got a Feeling is the cautious optimism of a whole generation. After this steady, stomping, driving energy, One After 909 is a blazing old school rocker from the Beatles' back catalog. It's a great fit for its setting. Rock and roll was just entering its back to basics phase in early 69 and fully in it by 1970. This performance is aptly boisterous and mischievous. You can hear the smiles on John and Paul's faces. Again, this rhythm section is rock solid. Ringo's famous swing is bubbling with bright energy, his sneaky fills punctuating the stop times. Billy displays all the hours he put in with Little Richard with ease. Of the piano ballads Paul contributed to Let It Be, I strongly prefer Long and Winding Road. Whereas Let It Be at times reads preachy due to its execution, or over-execution, Long and Winding Road is so vulnerable. This is like Paul's equivalent to Run of the Mill. He's begging and pleading for his old friend to acknowledge his feelings. Many times I've been alone and many times I've cried. Anyway, you'll never know the many ways I've tried. But he asserts they can fix things. The door will always be open, even if John's is shut. There was so much love between Lennon and McCartney, and it hurts knowing they could never quite reconcile the deep divides that manifested themselves through 1970. This song is meant to tug at your heartstrings, and that's just what the orchestra does, though I wish it didn't drown out Billy on organ. And the harp at the end is just no. But still, you can't keep a great song down. There are better songs about Pattie Boyd, See Something, but For You Blue is the cutest. It's George's simple little blues ditty. Elmore James got nothing on this, baby. About loving his wife. Who would win? Loving your wife? Or your best friend who also loves your wife? I always thought this was George on Slide, but no, it's John. The slide is one of the defining, most memorable things about this song. George pushed for a lo-fi approach on this one, in keeping with the original Get Back concept. Shout out to Glyn Johns for spearheading shoving newspaper in a piano to get this sound. And again, Ringo's little shuffle. He always understands the assignment. Sweet Loretta fart, she thought she was a cleaner, but she was a frying pan. Are we sure he didn't have ADHD? Everyone acts like Paul was holding the Beatles hostage over Maxwell. Hell, even I've made that joke before.
Maxwell Silverhammer made sure that she was dead.
But I was wrong. Get Back was the song that broke up the Beatles. It suffers from being over-rehearsed, though not as much as the title track. Though the riffs in I've Got a Feeling are better, Get Backs are my favorite and better afforded by dynamics. Note the gentle push until the burst. I love both the guitar and keys solos. They are the best on the record. And the inclusion of
Don't smoke.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves. I hope we pass the audition.
is dear. An appropriate callback to The Rooftop, and considering this was the last album the Beatles would put out, it's a sweet little goodbye to the fans. And now for the curious case of Get Back. Though I can't do a full review of this today, we've been here long enough, I want to make it known that I am a champion of Get Back, and that's not just because of who made it. Glyn's famous drum mic method exalts an already razor-sharp Ringo. Listen to this cymbal work on Long and Winding Road, or that spectacular punch on 909. This mix also pushes Billy Preston to center stage. I'm not sure how necessary Teddy Boy or a Get Back reprise were. Let It Be and Long and Winding Road back to back is not the sequencing choice I would have made. Slapping the thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves from Get Back on the end of 909, the opening track, is straight up baffling. It does include Don't Let Me Down, though not my preferred take. The only Rooftop take included is 909, which is just as strong as the album versions. 4-Minute Dig It is even stronger and actually makes sense in context with this stuff. This Long and Winding Road put me in a whole crisis. I genuinely cannot decide which I prefer. Because there's only one Rooftop performance and no fill overdub, the overall atmosphere of Get Back is a lot more subdued, casual, fun. So that begs the question, why do we need both? Because this honors the original vision, perhaps more than Let It Be Naked does. As for the hypothetical fate of a Get Back release, off the back of the White Album, this would have absolutely worked, but off the back of the uber-polished Abbey Road, no. This thing would have been dead in the water, seen as an artistic regression, not unlike McCartney 1. So, what have we learned today? The MVPs of the Get Back saga were Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, and Glyn Johns. Billy's presence saved this band in a crisis situation. He was a great player with a great vibe. Glyn was the unsung hero of this mess. Bless Get Back for finally giving him his dues. And I have to say, I didn't truly appreciate Ringo as a member of the Beatles until Get Back. He was a pocket musician with feel like no other and a much needed optimist in the room. Aside from the White Album firmly at number 1, my Beatles album ranking is always swapping around depending on what I've recently listened to. As for Let It Be, right now, it's number 2. Like the White Album, Let It Be came about through some truly insane circumstances, but these are some great songs, and not because of those circumstances, though that's why they exist. Amidst complicated feelings, confusion, muck, and a gun-wielding madman producer coming into the fold at the 11th hour, the light prevails. These are great songs in spite of all that. Songs I didn't consider until Get Back, which I didn't appreciate until Let It Be. Let It Be is a whole package, no, an ecosystem, a living, breathing thing with history. Though these guys were experiencing the growing pains of maybe not needing to play with each other anymore, in this moment they wanted to. That's why Let It Be is beautiful. My personal favorites off this one are Dig a Pony, Across the Universe, I've Got a Feeling, One After 909, and The Long and Winding Road, with an honorable mention to Save the Last Dance for Me / Don't Let Me Down and Take One of Don't Let Me Down from the Rooftop. If you want to keep up with all of my favorites from all of the Vinyl Mondays and the Mod Months, which is returning this Friday, I have a Spotify playlist linked in my description. I update it every week. And that's it! That was the Let It Be Redux. Now, I am gonna have to find space on my shelves for this fucking thing. I usually keep all my box sets behind me with all my books, but I don't know if that's gonna cut it anymore. The one thing that won't ever be switched around from this backdrop, though, is this. Total Assault. I've had it since Christmas, and back there it will stay. The day before I filmed last week's episode, Village Green, the last surviving member of my favorite band passed, and I'm not gonna lie to you, shit's been rough. There's nothing I could say about these guys that I haven't already in a brief history, but I will say that Let It Re was exactly what I needed to be working on this week. This and another big project that I will be announcing in part 3 of Mod Month. But anyway, what do you think about the Let It Be debacle? Leave a comment letting me know. I love hearing what you guys have to say about albums that I love, and remember, despite what some guy on the internet has to say, your opinion matters. If you like what I do here, you should like this video and subscribe to my channel. I post new episodes of Vinyl Monday every Monday morning at 11 and a new Mod Month every Friday at noon for the rest of the month. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you Friday. Bye! You are to bury me in this coat, do you understand me? Bury me with my MC5 t-shirt, but it's not going to be on my person, just bury it with me. Put it in the coffin. I am to be wearing this coat.